He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the framed photo of Evelyn on my mantel rattled. He thought he was the one in control. He thought he was the landlord and I was the tenant. He had conveniently forgotten, or perhaps he never actually checked the title. When I bought this guest house 7 years ago, I didn't just buy the building. I bought the entire 3-acre parcel of land the Thorne estate was sitting on. Marcus was living on a 99-year lease that I had granted him for a symbolic $1 a year. He didn't own the dirt under his feet. I did. I sat in the dark for a long time after he left. The vibration of the door had left a ringing in my ears. I felt a familiar, dull pressure in my chest. Not a heart attack, but the suffocating grip of stress. My doctor had warned me, "Arthur, don't be a hero. If you feel the pressure, call for help." I picked up the phone and called the main house. I called Elena. It was 11:30 p.m. She answered on the 5th ring, her voice thick with irritation. "Dad? What is it?" "I have the decorator coming at 7 in the morning. I need my sleep." "Elena, I'm not feeling well," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I have some chest pains. It's probably nothing, but could you drive me to the urgent care? Just to be safe." I heard a heavy, dramatic sigh. It was the sound of someone being asked to do a chore they found beneath them. "Dad, seriously? It's the middle of the night. If it was a real emergency, you'd call an ambulance. You're probably just having indigestion from that fish. Take an antacid and go to sleep. Don't overreact." Then came the click. She hung up. She didn't ask how bad the pain was. She didn't ask if I was scared. She told me I was a nuisance. The ache in my chest tightened, but it wasn't my heart. It was something deeper, the realization that the daughter I had raised had become a stranger. I called an Uber. I sat in the back of a silver sedan, clutching my chest, and let a stranger drive me to the hospital. It was stress-induced angina. They gave me a tablet and kept me for observation for a few hours. By 8 a.m., they cleared me to go home. As my Uber pulled back onto the property, I saw Elena's white SUV. It wasn't at the house. It was parked in front of a high-end yoga studio 3 miles away. She wasn't sleeping. She was just busy. That was the moment I realized that being a good father was no longer an option. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as an obstacle to be managed or a resource to be tapped. But I had one more surprise for them. I just didn't know they were going to strike first. The next morning, a man in a crisp uniform arrived at my door with a digital scanner and a thick, heavy envelope. "Arthur Vance? Legal delivery. Sign here." I opened the envelope. The words on the page were cold, precise, and surgical. It was a lawsuit filed in the Miami-Dade County Court. Marcus and Elena Thorne were seeking an emergency hearing for a legal conservatorship. They were accusing me of being mentally incapacitated. They claimed I was no longer capable of managing my own finances or my medical care. They were calling me senile. It was a legal execution. They wanted to turn me into a ward of the state, with them holding the keys to my vault. They wanted to make my invisibility permanent. I looked at the evidence attached to the petition. It was a report from a psychological expert named Dr. Silas Vane. I had never heard the name in my life. The report claimed I suffered from advanced dementia and paranoid delusions. I looked at the signature on the report. I looked at the legal stamps. A cold, dry laugh escaped my throat. They thought they were playing a game of checkers. They had no idea I had spent 40 years as the lead forensic auditor for the Department of Justice. They thought they were trapping an old man. They had just invited the auditor back to work. I stared at the name on that legal petition. Dr. Silas Vane. I repeated it slowly, the syllables feeling like grit in my mouth. A cold, dry laugh, more of a raspy cough, escaped my lips. In my 72 years, I had met thousands of people. CEOs, fraudsters, politicians, and world-class surgeons, but I had never, not once, met a man named Silas Vane. I didn't hesitate. I didn't pace the floor or call a lawyer to complain. I simply gripped that thick, white envelope in my hand, the paper feeling stark and clinical against my age-spotted skin, and I walked out the door. I crossed the perfectly manicured lawn, a sea of emerald green that separated my modest world from the glass and steel fortress they called home. The glass patio doors were wide open to the Florida breeze. I could hear the rhythmic clink of ice in expensive tumblers and the faint, vapid pulse of some trendy lounge music. They were by the pool, of course. Elena was stretched out on a white chaise lounge, her designer sunglasses masking her eyes. A glossy fashion magazine balanced on her stomach. Marcus stood at the outdoor bar, pouring himself a midday cocktail with the practiced ease of a man who didn't have a real job to return to. They looked untroubled. They looked like predators who had just finished setting a trap and were now casually waiting for the prey to stop twitching. As I stepped onto the patio, my shadow fell across Elena. She sat up with a start, sliding her glasses down her nose. "Dad? What are you doing here? You're interrupting our—" Her voice died in her throat when she saw the legal papers in my hand. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the petition, her eyes darting away toward the pool almost instantly. Marcus turned around, a fake, oily smile plastered on his face. "Arthur, we were just about to—" He stopped, his gaze landing on the envelope. The smile didn't just fade. It inverted into a sneer of pure annoyance before he quickly masked it with a layer of condescending pity. "What is this, Marcus?" I asked, my voice dangerously level. He put his drink down, wiped his hands on a silk towel and crossed his arms. He was moving into his power stance, the one he used to intimidate junior real estate agents. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "We were hoping you wouldn't see it like this. We were going to sit you down and talk right before the hearing. It's for your own good." "For my own good?" I repeated. "Look at the incident last week," he continued, stepping closer. "You were disoriented. You had chest pains. You're forgetting things, Arthur. You're becoming a danger to your own legacy. You need someone to manage your finances, to make sure the bills are paid, to handle medical decisions before you hurt yourself." He was gaslighting me with the very incident they had ignored. I looked at my daughter, the girl I used to read bedtime stories to. "Elena, is this what you want? You signed a document saying your own father is incompetent." She finally looked at me, but her eyes were like the pool water, bright, blue, and freezing cold. "It's what's best, Dad. We're just trying to help. We love you." "Love?" I said, and the word felt like ash. "You don't even know what that word means." That was when Marcus's patience snapped. The mask of the concerned son-in-law fell away, revealing the vulture underneath. He let out a short, sharp, ugly laugh. "See you in court, old man," he sneered. "Frankly, this outburst just proves our point. You're paranoid. That's exactly what Dr. Vane said. You better go find a public defender, because I really don't think you can afford a real lawyer for this." I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply turned around and walked back to my guest house. The sound of my front door clicking shut was the loudest thing I had ever heard. A final, definitive line in the sand. They thought they were looking at a frail, forgetful relic. They thought my world was a quiet, beige box where I did little more than doze in front of the television. They had lived on this property for years, and not once had they noticed the second door in the back of my walk-in closet. I pushed aside a rack of heavy wool coats I hadn't worn since Vermont. Behind them was a panel of reinforced steel, flush with the wall. It wasn't opened with a key. It was locked with a biometric scanner. I pressed my thumb to the cold glass. A soft green light flickered, and a heavy deadbolt slid back with a quiet, expensive snick. I stepped inside. This was my real home. The air in the room was cool, filtered, and perfectly still. There were no recliners or knitting projects here. Instead, 3 massive monitors glowed against the far wall, flanked by a stack of high-end servers and a dedicated, encrypted communication array. Marcus thought I was a retired pencil pusher, a mid-level accountant who had spent 40 years balance-checking small-town ledgers. He thought my greatest achievement was saving enough for a comfortable Florida retirement. He had no idea. 30 years ago in Washington, D.C., I wasn't Artie. The CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and the most powerful lobbyists in the capital had a different name for me. They called me the Auditor. I was the lead forensic investigator for the Department of Justice. I was the man they sent in when the numbers didn't just look wrong, they looked impossible. I didn't just follow the money, I dissected it. I was the man who could and did dismantle empires with a single spreadsheet. I had walked away from all of it to take care of Evelyn when she got her first diagnosis. I traded the thrill of the hunt for hospital waiting rooms and chemo schedules. I let the auditor die because my family needed Arthur. But today, Marcus and Elena had given the auditor a very good reason to come out of retirement. I sat down at the console. My fingers didn't tremble as I dialed a number I hadn't used in a decade. It was a private line to a firm that specialized in the kind of problem-solving the police couldn't handle. It rang twice before a sharp, professional voice answered. Avery Hayes. Avery, I said. It's Arthur Vance. There was a long pause, not of confusion but of shock. Mr. Vance. Her voice was suddenly breathless. My God. My father still talks about you. He always wondered what happened to the auditor. I'm in Miami, Avery. I need you here tomorrow. Bring your best team. The ones who know how to dig through the dirt. Just say the word, Arthur. What did they do? They filed for conservatorship, I said, my voice flat. They're claiming I'm senile. They want control of everything. Avery let out a short, sharp bark of disbelief. They're claiming you are senile? They have no idea who they just tried to put in a cage. Her voice shifted instantly into business mode. Understood. I'm on my way. Where do you want us to make the first cut? Avery Hayes arrived the next morning at 10 a.m. sharp. She didn't look like a high-powered operative. She wore a simple dark suit, her hair pulled into a severe bun, and her eyes were the color of cold flint. She carried a single, slim briefcase. She was substance over style, the exact opposite of Marcus. She stepped into my hidden office, her eyes sweeping over the servers and monitors with a single, appreciative nod. They really don't know, do they? They think I'm a confused old man, I replied, sliding the petition across the desk. And here is their expert, a Dr. Silas Vane. Avery picked up the document. She didn't read the whole thing. She just scanned the signature. Dr. Silas Vane, psychological evaluation. Got it. She snapped open her laptop and began tapping into a secure database. Give me 3 hours. Take 2, I replied. She gave me a thin, sharp smile. I'll call you in 1. For the next 60 minutes, I didn't just wait. I began mapping out the financial skeleton of Marcus's company, Thorn Global Holdings. I knew he'd created a web of LLCs, but I was building the framework. Avery was going to bring me the flesh. My secure line buzzed exactly 58 minutes later. Arthur. Avery's voice was crisp. It wasn't hard to find. When people are this arrogant, they leave the threads lying right on the floor. You're not going to believe this. Try me, I said. First off, Silas Vane is not a psychologist. He's not a psychiatrist, a neurologist, or even a general practitioner. I waited for the punchline. What is he, Avery? He's a dentist, she said. I let the word hang in the air. A dentist. A man who fills cavities had signed a legal document declaring one of the country's most brilliant forensic minds mentally incompetent. Or he was a dentist, Avery corrected. The state board revoked his license 5 years ago. He was running a pill mill out of a strip mall in Hialeah. So Marcus hadn't found an expert he could bribe. He had found a criminal. A disgraced, desperate man with nothing left to lose. Avery, I said, leaning forward. That's not a name you find on Google. How did a high-flying developer like Marcus find a disgraced dentist from Hialeah? That, Avery said, her voice tightening, is the part that matters. When Vane was arrested 5 years ago, he couldn't afford bail. Someone guaranteed the bond for him. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. Who guaranteed the bond, Avery? A shell corporation registered in Delaware, she said. Thorn Global Holdings ***. I leaned back in my chair. The pieces didn't just fall into place. They slammed together with the force of a wrecking ball. Marcus hadn't found Vane last week. He had owned this man for 5 years. He had paid his bail and likely his legal fees, keeping this compromised asset in his back pocket like a loaded gun, waiting for the day he needed a doctor to sign a piece of paper. This wasn't an impulsive act because I had refused the loan. The loan request was just a test. This was premeditated. He had been planning to seize my estate for years. "Avery," I said, my voice low and hard, "you've neutralized the doctor. Now it's my turn. I'm going into the numbers. I want to see exactly how much blood is on Marcus's hands." "Be careful, Arthur," she said. "They should have been," I replied. I closed the door to my hidden office, and the world outside, the humid Florida air, the sound of the ocean, the fake smiles of my family, simply ceased to exist. In here, the world was reduced to the soft, rhythmic hum of cooling fans and the neon glow of my 3 monitors. This was my true element. Marcus looked at me and saw a man who belonged in a museum, a relic of an era when finance was done with ledgers and green eyeshades. He didn't realize that I had helped build the very systems he now tried to use to hide his tracks. I was a digital ghost, and I was about to haunt every server he had ever touched. I started with the company that had bailed out the disgraced dentist, Thorn Global Holdings. On the surface, it was a standard Delaware LLC, anonymous, shielded, and layered. Marcus wasn't stupid, but he was arrogant, and in my experience, arrogance is the mother of all sloppy mistakes. He had created a nesting doll of legal entities, Thorn Global owned by Key West Development, which was owned by the Thorn Family Trust, all designed to make it impossible to see the man holding the strings. But Marcus was also cheap. To register these companies, to file the paperwork with the Secretary of State, and to set up the corresponding bank accounts, he had used the same personal email address for every single one. It was an old burner account he probably thought was clever. MarcusThornPro@webmail.com. He didn't know that, in the world of forensic auditing, deleted is just a suggestion. I didn't need to hack his email, that would be illegal, and I was going to dismantle him entirely by the book. I just needed to see the metadata. I ran that email address through a series of backdoor databases I still had access to, financial mainframes the DOJ had established decades ago and never quite bothered to fully close to their old scalpels. I was looking for patterns. Correspondence with lenders, wire transfers, and loan applications. Within 30 minutes, I hit the mother lode. The email was tied to a secure data room used for high-stakes lending. But the lender wasn't a reputable bank like JP Morgan or Chase. It was a firm called Blackwood Ridge Capital. The name made the hair on my arms stand up. Blackwood Ridge weren't bankers. They were vulture capitalists. They didn't provide loans to healthy businesses. They found desperate men who had been rejected by every legitimate institution and offered them a lifeline that was actually an anchor. I couldn't enter the data room itself, but the server logs told the story. It was a bloodbath. Marcus's 9-figure Riviera deal wasn't a success. It was a catastrophic failure. He had run out of cash halfway through the construction of the main hotel tower. To get the initial funding, he had falsified his liquidity reports. He had lied to his contractors, who were now filing multi-million-dollar liens against the property. The logs showed a total capital burn of nearly $60 million. And Blackwood Ridge had finally lost their patience. The emails were no longer professional. They were frantic demands. Then I found the final notice, sent exactly 1 week ago, the day after I refused Marcus's request for a $500,000 bridge loan. It was a capital call. Blackwood Ridge was activating the emergency clause in his contract. They weren't asking for $500,000. They were demanding an immediate $5 million in interest and penalties. They gave him 10 business days. If he didn't pay, they wouldn't just take the hotel project. They would trigger a cross-collateralization clause. They would seize everything. The Thorn estate, the cars, every penny in every account tied to his name. They were going to wipe him out. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, perfect logic. He didn't need my money for a project. He needed it as a desperate, good faith payment to keep the wolves from the door. And when I said no, he activated his contingency plan, the plan he had been sitting on for 5 years. He wasn't suing me to get a small loan. He was suing me because he was bankrupt. He needed to liquidate my entire estate to save his own skin. But then a new question formed in my mind, a cold one that settled in my gut. Marcus was bankrupt. He was being hunted by vultures. So where did he get the cash to launch a legal attack on me? Lawsuits aren't cheap. A firm like the one he'd hired would demand a massive retainer up front. And a man like Dr. Vane, a disgraced criminal, wouldn't sign a perjured document for a promise of future payment. He'd want cash in hand. Where did a man with frozen credit find $100,000 in liquid cash? My mind flashed back to the Sunday dinner, to Elena bragging about her upcoming charity gala. When my wife Evelyn died, I took a large portion of the money from the sale of our Vermont home, about $4 million, and placed it into a charitable trust. I called it the Evelyn Vance Foundation. Its mission was to fund early-stage breast cancer research, the kind of work that might have saved her. I had made Elena the managing director. I thought it would give her a sense of purpose and a connection to her mother. I was the founder with full oversight rights, but in 7 years, I had never once exercised them. I trusted her. I picked up the phone and dialed the private bank in Boston that managed the foundation's assets. A banker I hadn't spoken to in years answered, his voice dripping with surprise. "Mr. Vance, it's been so long. We usually only hear from your daughter." "I'm sure you do," I said, my voice like ice. "I'm invoking my founder's rights. I need a full, detailed statement of every expenditure and transfer from the Evelyn Vance Foundation for the last 12 months. I need it in 5 minutes. Secure email." The PDF arrived in 4. I opened the file, my hands perfectly still. I looked at the top line. The total asset value was supposed to be well over $4 million. The number staring back at me was $342,000. I scrolled down, my blood turning to liquid nitrogen. The foundation was hemorrhaging. I saw the small, legitimate donations, $5,000 to a clinic, $10,000 to a lab. And then I saw the administrative fees and consulting services. They were massive. $150,000 paid out 2 months ago to Thorn Global Holdings. Marcus had billed his mother-in-law's charity for consulting. $80,000 for gala planning to a company called Vanguard Event Group. Took me 60 seconds to run the name. It was a shell company registered 3 months ago to a P.O. box in a strip mall. The sole proprietor? Marcus Thorn. But the final, soul-crushing blow wasn't in the line items. It was in the proof of payment. I clicked the link to the scanned images of the checks. The check for $150,000 to Marcus's company. The check for $80,000 to his shell group. I looked at the signature line. It wasn't Marcus's handwriting. It was an elegant, flowing script I had seen on 1,000 birthday cards and graduation photos. It was Elena's. I closed my eyes for a moment. I had prepared myself for Marcus's corruption. He was a shark, and sharks eat. I had even prepared myself to find that Elena was weak or manipulated. But this wasn't weakness. These were her signatures, authorized and clear. She wasn't a victim. She was a partner. She was looting her own mother's legacy to fund her husband's crumbling fantasy. She was stealing money meant for cancer patients and using it to pay the lawyers who were currently trying to have her father declared insane. They weren't just robbing me. They were using Evelyn's memory to finance my execution. I opened my eyes. The grief and the shock didn't just fade. They evaporated. They were replaced by something sharp and perfectly clear. The daughter I had loved had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I picked up the secure line to Avery Hayes. "Avery," I said. My voice sounded different, even to me. It was flat, hard, like polished steel. "Arthur? I'm still digging into the law firm. They're bottom feeders, but—" "Change of plans," I interrupted. "We are no longer on defense. We aren't going to disprove their case. We are going to end them, root and stem." There was a long silence on the other end. "Arthur, what did you find?" "I found my daughter's signature on the checks that paid for my own destruction," I said. "And I found the name of the vulture fund Marcus is in bed with. Blackwood Ridge Capital." "Arthur, Blackwood Ridge is dangerous," Avery warned. "They don't negotiate. They just liquidate." "I know exactly who they are," I said. And for the first time in a decade, a cold, thin smile touched my lips. "And more importantly, I know the man who owns them." I stared at the computer screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes as I looked at the digital image of Elena's signature. The elegant loops of her handwriting, once a source of pride for me, now looked like the coiled body of a viper. The grief I had been carrying for weeks, the heavy, suffocating weight of wondering where I had gone wrong as a father, didn't just vanish. It transformed. It became something cold, hard, and perfectly sharp. In the world of high-stakes auditing, we had a saying, "The numbers don't have feelings and they never lie." My daughter had chosen her side, and she had chosen to use her mother's legacy as a weapon against me. I picked up the secure receiver of my satellite phone. I didn't feel the tremor in my hands anymore. "Avery," I said when she picked up on the first ring. "Forget the defense. We are not going to court to prove I'm sane. We are going there to perform an autopsy." "Arthur? What's happened?" Avery's voice was alert, the professional hunter sensing the change in the wind. "I found the trail," I told her, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "They didn't just steal from me. They looted the Evelyn Vance Foundation to pay for the lawyers and the bribe for that dentist." Elena signed the checks herself. She used her mother's cancer research fund to finance my legal execution. I heard Avery's sharp intake of breath over the line. "My God, Arthur. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," I replied. "Be ready. You mentioned Blackwood Ridge Capital earlier. You said they were the ones holding the $5 million capital call over Marcus's head." "Yes," she said, her tone shifting back to business. "They're a vulture fund. They specialize in distressed assets and aggressive liquidations. They've already started the clock on him." "I know exactly who they are," I said, a thin, ghost-like smile touching my lips. "And more importantly, I know the man who built that empire from the dirt up. His name is Julian Sterling." Avery went silent for a moment. "Julian Sterling? Arthur, he's one of the most feared men on Wall Street. He doesn't take meetings, and he certainly doesn't do favors." "He does for me," I said quietly. 30 years ago, long before Blackwood Ridge was a titan of industry, Julian Sterling was just a brash, arrogant young trader who had gotten himself caught in the middle of the Enright Corporation scandal. The SEC was ready to crucify him. They were convinced he was the architect of a billion-dollar fraud, and they were preparing a 20-year sentence in federal prison to prove it. I was the lead investigator on that case. I spent 3 straight weeks living on caffeine and spreadsheets, digging through encrypted server logs that everyone else said were a dead end. I found the proof, not of Julian's guilt, but of his innocence. I found the original timestamp trades that showed he was a pawn in the game, not the king. I cleared his name because it was the truth, and because my job was to make the books balance. Julian went on to build a multi-billion-dollar empire. He called me once, 10 years ago, right after Evelyn's funeral. His voice had been quiet, stripped of its usual bravado. He told me that if I ever needed anything, a new life, a clean slate, or a blank check, all I had to do was call. I had never called. Until today. I ended the call with Avery and dialed a private, 11-digit number I had committed to memory years ago. It bypassed the switchboards and the assistants. It rang twice. "Sterling." A booming, confident voice answered. "Julian," I said. "It's Arthur Vance." The silence on the other end was absolute, as if the entire world had stopped spinning for a second. When he spoke again, the arrogance was gone, replaced by a trace of genuine reverence. "Arthur," he whispered, "I thought you'd gone off the grid. Is everything okay?" "I'm cashing in my chip, Julian," I said, getting straight to the point. "Name it," he replied without a second of hesitation. "Anything. You have a loan out to a developer in Miami named Marcus Thorne," I told him. "A luxury hotel project in the Keys. He's in default." I heard the rapid-fire clicking of a keyboard on the other end. "Thorne. Yeah, I see it. It's a $60 million disaster. My team is moving to seize the collateral on Monday. The guy is a bottom feeder, Arthur. He lied about his liquidity from day one." "I don't want you to seize his assets, Julian," I said. "I want you to sell me the debt. All of it. The note, the liens, the default rights, everything." Julian paused. Arthur, that's toxic paper. It's a mess of litigation and unpaid contractors. Why would you want to buy that? I'm not buying it as an investment, I said, my voice dropping an octave. I want to be his sole creditor. I'll wire the full outstanding principal, $5 million, right now from a blind trust. I want a quiet transfer of ownership. No paper trail back to me. Julian was a shark, and he knew a bloodbath when he saw one. He didn't ask why anymore. He didn't need to. You want to be the monster, Arthur? He asked, his voice low with a kind of dark respect. Fine. You saved my life once. It's the least I can do. I'll have my lawyers execute the transfer within the hour. The debt is yours. Good hunting. I hung up and immediately called Avery back. It's done, I told her. Blackwood Ridge no longer holds the note. I do. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. Arthur, you bought his debt? You're his bank now. I'm his nightmare, I corrected her. Now I need you to finish drafting that writ of seizure. He's in default on a $5 million loan to me. I want a lien on the mansion. I want his cars. I want Thorne Global Holdings. I want it all. I'll have a server at his door within 60 minutes, Avery said, her voice full of professional excitement. No, I said, stopping her. We're not going to serve him. We're not going to warn him. He's expecting a fight over my sanity. He has no idea his entire life is already on the line. I looked at the date on the court petition, the date of the hearing where they plan to strip me of my rights. We are going to walk into that courtroom, I said, and we are going to hand it to him right in front of the judge. I spent the rest of the night in that hidden office, not as a victim, but as the auditor. I prepared the final spreadsheets, the ones that mapped out every dollar stolen from the foundation and every lie told to the lenders. Outside, the sun began to rise over the Atlantic, casting long, golden fingers across the marble floors of the Thorne estate. I watched from my window as Marcus walked out to his balcony, probably imagining he was looking at his future empire. He didn't know that the very ground he was standing on had already shifted. He didn't know that I wasn't just his father-in-law anymore. I was his owner. The books were ready to be balanced. And in my world, the debt always gets paid. The morning of the hearing arrived with a clinical, unforgiving brightness. I stood in front of the mirror in my guest house, but I didn't see the Artie that Marcus and Elena had spent months trying to manufacture. I didn't see a frail retiree in a soft-knit sweater or corduroys. Today I was putting on armor. I reached into the back of my closet and pulled out a charcoal gray, single-breasted suit from Seville Row. I hadn't worn it in over a decade. Not since I had stepped into a hearing room to testify before a Senate banking committee. It still fit perfectly, the fabric heavy and expensive, draped over my shoulders like a promise of things to come. I had my hair cut short, my face clean-shaven, and my eyes, the eyes of the auditor, were as clear and sharp as a winter morning. I was no longer the man they thought they were fading into invisibility. I was the man I had always been. Avery Hayes was waiting for me in the long, fluorescent-lit hallway outside Department 5B. She looked at me, her face impassive but her eyes showing a flicker of genuine respect. She held a single, slim briefcase, containing everything we needed to dismantle a life. "Are you ready, Arthur?" she asked quietly. "I've been ready for years," I said. The doors opened and we walked in. The courtroom was small, beige, and smelled of stale coffee and cheap floor wax. It was exactly the kind of joyless, bureaucratic room where lives are often quietly dismantled by those who think they can play God with a legal petition. Marcus and Elena were already seated at the petitioner's table. They were whispering to each other, giddy with anticipation, looking like they were waiting for a prize to be handed to them. Their lawyer, a man named Fierro with too much gel in his hair and a suit that was a bit too shiny, was shuffling papers with supreme confidence. Then they saw me. I watched Elena's face as she looked up. When she saw me in my suit, the suit she hadn't seen since her mother's funeral, a nervous, suppressed giggle escaped her lips. She put her hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. I knew what she was whispering to Marcus. Asterisk, look at him. Dad thinks this is a grand occasion or something star. Marcus just smirked. He let his eyes run over my posture and my clothes, and then he shook his head slowly. To him, this wasn't dignity. It was a pathetic, last-ditch effort. A dying animal puffing up its fur to look bigger than it was. Fierro glanced at me, sized me up as a frail 72-year-old man playing dress-up, and immediately dismissed me. They had no idea that the prey they had been hunting had just turned into the hunter. Avery and I sat down at the respondents' table. We didn't talk. We didn't whisper. We just waited in a silence that felt like a coiled spring. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, his voice echoing through the small chamber. The side door opened, and the judge entered. He was a man in his 60s, robed in black, looking tired, as if he had seen too many family squabbles and not enough justice. He settled into his high-backed chair, the leather groaning under his weight. "Please be seated," he mumbled, putting on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses. His nameplate read, Judge John Carmichael. "Good morning," the judge began, his voice a dull monotone. "We are here for case number 881B, in the matter of the conservatorship of Arthur Vance." He read the name and then, as procedure dictated, he looked up from his papers to identify the respondent. He looked right at me. In that moment, the air seemed to leave the room. Judge Carmichael didn't just pause, he froze. His face, which had been a mask of weary bureaucracy, went white, ashen. His eyes, magnified by his glasses, widened in a look of pure, unadulterated disbelief. The cheap ballpoint pen he was holding slipped from his fingers. It clattered loudly onto the wooden desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the dead-silent courtroom. Marcus and Elena were staring at the judge, confused. Fierro looked up, annoyed by the sudden interruption of the routine. But the judge's hand, the one that had dropped the pen, was visibly shaking. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He leaned forward, forgetting the microphone, and in a voice that was caught and amplified, a voice filled with shock, he whispered one thing. "My God! Is that really him?" Every head in the courtroom swiveled toward me. Marcus and Elena's faces were blank with confusion. They didn't understand what was happening. This wasn't part of the script. I recognized him, too. I recognized John Carmichael. But the man I knew wasn't a weary judge in a small courtroom. The man I knew was a 35-year-old assistant U.S. attorney, terrified, ambitious, and way over his head. He had been handed the biggest case of his young career, the Enright Corporation fraud, a billion-dollar house of cards. And he had been losing. His case was falling apart, his witnesses were being discredited, and he was about to lose everything until his expert witness took the stand. I was that expert witness. I was the man they brought in when the numbers were a tangled mess of lies. I was the one who, in a single day, took a billion-dollar fraud and laid it bare on a single spreadsheet for the jury to see. I was the one who put 12 CEOs and their accountants in federal prison. John Carmichael hadn't just known me. I had made him. I had handed him his career on a silver platter. The judge finally tore his eyes away from me and slowly, deliberately, turned his gaze to the petitioner's table. He glared at Fierro, the slick lawyer with the shiny suit. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice no longer tired, but sharp, cold, and dangerous. "Are you aware of who your respondent is?" Fierro, looking baffled, stood up shakily. He's Arthur Vance, Your Honor. A retiree." Judge Carmichael let out a short, harsh breath. A warning. "No, Counselor," he said, his voice ringing through the silent room. "That is the man they used to call the Scalpel. Arthur Vance." He looked back at me, a mixture of respect and dread in his eyes, before turning back to Fierro. "Good luck, Counselor," the judge added, his voice dripping with grim irony. "You're going to need it." Fierro, the lawyer representing Marcus and Elena, looked like he had just swallowed a live wasp. He was visibly sweating now, his confidence leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. He glanced back at Marcus, who was nodding urgently, his face a mask of frantic, silent commands to get the proceedings back on track. Clearing his throat and adjusting his tie with a trembling hand, Fierro addressed the bench. Your Honor, despite any past professional associations, the facts of the petition remain. The petitioners call our primary witness to the stand, Dr. Silas Vane. A side door near the back of the room opened, and a small, greasy-looking man in an ill-fitting polyester suit scurried into the courtroom. He looked less like a medical professional and more like someone who spent his days in the back of a pawn shop. He avoided looking at the judge, his eyes darting nervously toward Marcus as he took the stand and was sworn in. Fierro, trying to project a sense of normalcy, began his questioning. Dr. Vane, did you have the occasion to evaluate the respondent, Arthur Vance? I did, Vane said. His voice was oily and carried the flat, rehearsed tone of someone reading from a script he hadn't quite memorized. And what were your clinical findings? Vane put on a pair of smudged, thick-rimmed glasses and opened a folder. Mr. Vance presented with severe signs of cognitive decline. His short-term memory is, frankly, non-existent. He exhibits classic symptoms of paranoid delusions, particularly concerning his family's intentions and his own financial standing. I sat perfectly still, watching him. He was describing a ghost, the man they wanted the world to believe I had become. In your professional opinion, Fierro pushed on, is Mr. Vance capable of managing his own affairs? Absolutely not, Vane said, shaking his head with a performance of heavy sadness. He is a danger to himself and his significant assets. He requires immediate, full-time legal and medical supervision. Fierro smiled, a weak but triumphant little expression. Thank you, Doctor. Your witness. Avery Hayes stood up slowly. She didn't carry a stack of folders or a laptop. She held only a single, thin sheet of paper as she walked toward the witness box. The courtroom went so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Good morning, Dr. Vane, Avery said. Her voice was polite and quiet, but it had an edge to it that made Vane shift uncomfortably in his seat. Or perhaps I should call you Mr. Vane. It is Mr., isn't it? Vane blinked, looking confused. It's Doctor. Is it? Avery turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have searched the state medical database, the American Psychological Association, and the Board of Neurology. I can find no record of a Silas Vane ever being licensed as a psychologist, psychiatrist, or medical doctor in the state of Florida. She turned back to the witness, her eyes narrowing. Mr. Vane, exactly what kind of doctor are you? Vane's face went pale. He looked at Fierro for help, but the lawyer was busy staring at his own shoes. I have a medical background, Vane stammered. Objection. Relevance. Fierro shouted, jumping to his feet. Overruled. Judge Carmichael snapped, his eyes fixed on Vane with terrifying intensity. Sit down, counselor. The witness will answer the question. What is your medical background, Mr. Vane? Vane swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I was a dentist. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marcus's face was suddenly as white as the marble in his foyer. A dentist, Avery repeated, letting the word ring through the room. Or to be more accurate, a former dentist. Isn't that right? I'm retired. Vane lied, his voice cracking. Retired. Avery's voice was suddenly a whip crack. Or was your license to practice dentistry permanently revoked by the state of Florida in 2021? Vane began to shake. That isn't. It's a matter of public record, Mr. Vane. Avery continued, relentless now. Your license was revoked for gross misconduct, specifically for systematic insurance fraud and for operating an illegal prescription pill mill out of a strip mall in Hialeah. Is that correct? Vane had no answer. He looked like a cornered rat, his eyes darting wildly between Marcus and the judge. Objection. This is badgering. Fierro screamed. This is cross-examination, counselor, the judge barked. And I find it fascinating. Please continue, Ms. Hayes. Avery took a final step closer to the witness box. Just one more question, Mr. Vane, for your expert opinion. Did you, or did you not, receive a wire transfer of $25,000 from a corporation named Thorn Global Holdings exactly 3 days before you signed this fraudulent diagnosis. Objection. Speculation. No foundation. Fierro was nearly hysterical. Avery didn't even look at him. She walked to the evidence projector and placed the single sheet of paper onto the glass. The image flashed onto the wall. A stark, black and white bank transfer receipt for the entire courtroom to see. From Thorn Global Holdings to Silas Vane. Amount $25,000. Memo, consulting. Judge Carmichael's face turned a deep, furious red. He glared at Vane, who looked as if he were about to be physically ill. Mr. Vane. The judge's voice was a low growl of thunder. You are under oath. You have just committed blatant, egregious perjury in my courtroom. You have filed a fraudulent medical document with this court in a criminal conspiracy with the petitioners. He pointed a shaking finger toward the back of the room. Bailiff, take this man into custody immediately. He is under arrest for perjury and filing false instruments. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed in the stunned silence. Elena let out a small, terrified squeak, her hand flying to her mouth. Marcus sat rigid, staring as his star witness was led away in chains. Their entire case had just been put in handcuffs. But I wasn't finished. I looked at Marcus, whose rage was now beginning to override his fear. He grabbed his lawyer by the sleeve and hissed something in his ear. He was a man drowning, and he was about to try to pull the rest of us down with him. With his star witness in handcuffs, Fierro was completely adrift. He stood at the petitioner's table, sputtering and shuffling through his notes, while Judge Carmichael looked at him with the kind of expression one might use for something scraped off a shoe. Marcus, however, was beyond pale. He was a vibrating, blotchy red. The shock had finally been replaced by a cornered, feral rage. He grabbed Fierro by the sleeve and hissed a command into the lawyer's ear. Fierro, looking terrified of his own client, stood up shakily. Your Honor, Fierro stammered. My client, Mr. Thorn, would like to take the stand to clarify this unfortunate misunderstanding. Judge Carmichael raised a skeptical eyebrow. Oh, he does he? He wants to testify after his primary witness was just arrested for perjury. The judge looked at Avery. Ms. Hayes, any objection? Avery stood, a small, knowing smile on her lips. Not at all, Your Honor. We would be delighted to hear what Mr. Thorn has to say. Very well, the judge said, his voice laced with ice. Mr. Thorn, take the stand. You are, of course, under oath. Marcus shoved his way to the witness box, practically pushing the bailiff aside in his haste. He was trying to project the image of a confident man, but he was a man drowning, and every move he made was just creating more bubbles. He gripped the railing of the box until his knuckles were white. Your Honor, Marcus started, his voice a slick, practiced performance of a wounded victim. He spoke directly to the judge, completely ignoring me and Avery. This is a travesty. My wife and I, we are just worried about Arthur. That's all this has ever been about. He pointed a finger at me, his voice trembling with fake emotion. He is confused. He's paranoid. He locks himself in that guest house for days, hiding his finances. He even accused me of trying to steal from him. All we wanted to do was help him to protect him from himself. And now, this. He was trying to look heartbroken, but to anyone with a discerning eye, it came across as monstrous. He's not lucid, Your Honor, Marcus added, looking at the judge for sympathy. Fierro, seeing a small opening, asked, So, your only motivation was concern for his well-being? 100%, Marcus said, oozing false sincerity. Avery Hayes stood up again. She walked toward the witness box with a kind of surgical curiosity. Mr. Thorn, she began quietly, you just testified under oath that my client, Mr. Vance, is not lucid and is paranoid. That's right, Marcus said, puffing up his chest. He's deeply confused. And his confusion centers on his finances, you said? Avery asked. Yes, absolutely, Marcus replied confidently. He doesn't understand money. He's from a different time. He doesn't grasp modern finance. Avery nodded slowly. I see. And is that why you believe he's not lucid? Because he doesn't understand modern finance. It's a major part of it, yes, Marcus said. So, Avery continued, her voice still mild. When you approached him 2 weeks ago and asked him to give you $500,000, you were what? Testing his lucidity? Marcus's face tightened as he saw the trap. I was offering him an investment, a chance to be part of the family's success. You asked a man you believed to be confused and paranoid for $500,000? Avery asked. Marcus tried to dance around it. It was his refusal that proved our point. I offered him the deal of a lifetime, a golden opportunity, a guaranteed 40% return in 6 months on my luxury resort project. It was a slam dunk. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, he refused. He said it was too risky. He was too senile, too scared to see a golden opportunity when it was staring him in the face. Marcus was feeling bold now, thinking he had turned the argument around. That's when Elena and I knew he had truly lost it. He was letting his paranoia get in the way of a fortune. He had just built his own gallows. A golden opportunity, Mr. Thorne? Avery's voice was no longer mild. It was cold. A slam dunk? Absolutely, Marcus said, arrogant to the last. That project is gold. Is that why the project is currently $50 million over budget and facing 16 contractor liens for non-payment? Avery asked. The color drained from Marcus's face instantly. He stammered, That's a lie. That's privileged information. It's not privileged when you're in default, Mr. Thorne, Avery said, her voice rising. Isn't it true that your primary lender, Blackwood Ridge Capital, found you in breach of your loan covenants and issued a capital call for $5 million due 10 days ago? Marcus was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked at Fierro, who was staring at his client in pure horror. A $5 million demand, and you didn't have it, Avery pressed. You were, and are, completely, hopelessly bankrupt, weren't you? No, Marcus roared, his composure finally shattering. It's a temporary cash flow problem. The project is sound. You were bankrupt, Avery repeated, relentless. Your credit was frozen, and yet you found the money to hire Mr. Fierro. You found $25,000 in cash to bribe a disgraced dentist. She took a step closer. Where did you get that money, Mr. Thorne? Marcus was trapped. He looked at Elena, then at the judge. Avery provided the answer for him. You got it from a charity, she said, her voice dropping, filled with contempt. You got it from the Evelyn Vance Foundation. At the sound of her mother's name, Elena, who had been frozen in her seat, let out a tiny, choked sound. Isn't that right, Mr. Thorne? Avery thundered. When your empire was collapsing, you turned to your wife and had her sign checks. You convinced her to steal from her dead mother's cancer charity. You can't prove that. Marcus spat. I can, Avery said, holding up a new set of documents. $150,000 paid to Thorne Global for consulting. $80,000 paid to Vanguard Event Group, a shell company you own. A total of $230,000 embezzled from a fund for cancer research. She turned and looked for the first time at Elena. He didn't just lie to the court, Elena. He lied to you. That was when my daughter broke. She shot to her feet, her face a mask of disbelief and rage, and screamed at her husband. You lied to me. You told me those were legal administrative fees. You told me it was all approved. You were stealing from my mother. Marcus finally completely lost it. All the charm and performance boiled away, leaving only the raw, ugly man underneath. He stood up in the witness box, his face purple, and pointed a shaking finger at me. Shut up, Elena, he shrieked. This is all his fault. All of it. That selfish old man. He had the money. He could have fixed everything. He just had to write a check. And he said no. He made me do it. The courtroom was chaos. Elena was sobbing hysterically, and Marcus was screaming at her to shut up. Judge Carmichael slammed his gavel so hard it sounded like a gunshot. "Silence," he roared. "Mr. Thorne, you will sit down and be silent, or I will have you held in contempt. Madam, control yourself." The room fell into a deathly, heavy quiet. Judge Carmichael's eyes, cold and furious, swiveled to me. He stared at me for a long moment, the anger in his face softening into respect. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice calm but authoritative, "the petition is still before me. Do you have anything you wish to say in your defense regarding your own competency?" I rose to my feet slowly, the heavy fabric of my Seville row suit settling perfectly as I stood. I didn't lean on the table for support, nor did I waver as I faced the bench. I stood straight, my hands clasped loosely behind my back, looking every bit the man who had once dismantled the most complex financial frauds in the country. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I looked at Marcus, then at Elena, and finally up at Judge Carmichael. "Thank you, Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and carrying through the small room. "But I am not here today to argue about my sanity. I am not here to defend myself against these baseless accusations. My competency is not in question. My record throughout my career speaks for itself." I paused, letting the weight of my words land. "No, Your Honor," I continued. "I didn't come here today to be a respondent. I came here to file a criminal complaint." Fierro, the lawyer with the shiny suit, leaped to his feet one last time. "Objection. This is pure theater. This is not the proper venue for such claims." "Sit down, counselor," Judge Carmichael roared, his voice shaking the desk. "You opened this door. You brought this man into my court, accusing him of delusion. The court will hear exactly what he has to say. Proceed, Mr. Vance." I turned my gaze to Marcus. He was staring at me, his eyes wide with a new, dawning horror as he realized I wasn't just defending myself. I was attacking. "Mr. Thorne has just confessed to part of it," I said, my voice flat and clinical, like a surgeon describing a terminal condition. "He confessed to embezzling $230,000 from a charitable foundation, my late wife's foundation, the Evelyn Vance Foundation." I then turned my gaze slowly, deliberately, to my daughter. She was watching me, her face streaked with tears and ruined mascara, her eyes pleading for a mercy she hadn't earned. "But he didn't act alone," I said, holding her gaze until she looked away. "He couldn't. He needed a signature. He needed the authorization of the foundation's managing director." I looked back at the judge. "Elena, you signed those checks. You knowingly, and with full intent, looted your own mother's legacy to fund your husband's failing business and to finance this pathetic attempt to seize my assets." Elena let out a wail, a sound of pure animal despair. No, I didn't know. He told me they were just fees." "You signed them," I stated, cutting through her protest. "It wasn't an accusation. It was an audited fact." Marcus, seeing his wife crumble and his world dissolving into a series of criminal charges, found one last surge of desperate, cornered bravado. He stood up, knocking his chair over with a loud crash. He let out a high-pitched, hysterical laugh. "You can't do anything to me," he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You're a nobody. You've got nothing. You think you can file a complaint? It's my word against hers. And you're just a sad, senile old man living in a guest house." His voice was cracking, but he was trying to convince himself he was still the king of the mountain. "You're broke, Arthur. You have nothing left but that suit. You are nothing." I just waited. I let his voice echo and die against the beige walls. I let the silence return, heavier than before. I let him stand there, panting, a failed man on a stage of his own making. Then I smiled, a thin, cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Ah," I said, my voice quiet but heard by everyone. "About that." I turned my head and gave a single, slight nod to Avery Hayes. She stood up, said nothing, and reached into her slim briefcase. She removed a single, thick stack of documents bound with a blue legal cover. She did not hand it to the judge, nor did she hand it to me. She walked across the aisle, straight to the petitioner's table, and placed the document directly in front of Marcus Thorne. What is this? Marcus stammered, looking at the ominous blue folder as if it were a bomb. That, Mr. Thorne, Avery said, her voice clear and ringing through the room, is an emergency notice of foreclosure and seizure. Fierro snatched the paper, his eyes scanning the first page. His face, which had been pale, turned the color of ash. This is impossible, he whispered. This is from Blackwood Ridge Capital. But the date. Marcus snatched the paper back from his lawyer. What is it? What does it say? It seems you're a little behind on the news, Marcus, I said, my voice conversational. You were quite right earlier. You defaulted on your $5 million loan to Blackwood Ridge Capital. They were, as you suspected, preparing to seize all your assets. A terrible shame. Marcus was staring at the paper, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it. This says the debt was sold. Yes, it was, I said. They were very motivated to sell. It was, as you called it, toxic paper. And when you couldn't pay them, I stepped in. I bought that debt, Marcus. All of it. The note, the loan, the collateral, the default rights, everything. I took a slow step forward. You defaulted on your loan, Marcus. But you didn't default on Blackwood Ridge. You defaulted on me. I watched the last traces of color drain from his face as the soul-shattering reality of his situation landed. And I continued, am not as patient as Julian Sterling. I am not offering an extension. I am not interested in a temporary cash flow explanation. I am calling the note. Effective immediately. Marcus looked up at me, his mouth open in a silent scream. I pointed toward the window, in the direction of the estate. The mansion you live in? It's mine. I pointed at the keys on the table. The cars you drive? They are mine. I pointed at the corporate folders. Your entire Thorne global empire? It belongs to me. I leaned in just enough so he could see the cold fire in my eyes. Everything you thought was yours now belongs to the man you tried to erase. I turned back to Judge Carmichael, who was watching this entire exchange with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. Your Honor, I said, my voice ringing with finality. This pathetic conservatorship hearing is over. I believe the eviction and criminal proceedings should begin now. The legal proceedings that followed that day in Department 5B weren't so much a trial as they were a clinical dissection. Marcus was finished from the moment he stood in that witness box and screamed his own confession into the record. A man who admits to criminal intent in front of a sitting judge doesn't have many moves left on the board. The evidence Avery and I had compiled acted as an airtight coffin. A mountain of paper that documented every lie, every forged invoice, and every dollar moved from the foundation to his shell companies. Marcus tried to fight, of course. Arrogance like his doesn't die easily. He hired a new, even more expensive lawyer, likely using the last of the credit he hadn't yet been stripped of. They tried to argue that he was under extreme duress, painting me as a vindictive, manipulative mastermind who had entrapped a desperate businessman. It was a pathetic, transparent defense, like a rat caught in a steel trap trying to blame the cheese for being too tempting. The district attorney, however, had taken a very keen interest in the case after Judge Carmichael's scathing report. They didn't even break a sweat. They offered Marcus a plea deal to spare the state a trial, but he refused, still believing he could sell his way out of a prison cell. So they took him to trial and they buried him. I didn't even have to take the stand. Avery's documentation and my financial forensics did all the talking for me. The jury was out for less than an hour before they returned with a verdict of guilty on 12 counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and aggravated embezzlement. Judge Carmichael, presiding over the sentencing, looked at Marcus, this man who had tried to destroy a father's life to cover his own debts, and he made an example of him. Marcus wasn't given a slap on the wrist or sent to some white-collar resort. He was sentenced to 10 years in a state penitentiary. I watched from the gallery as they led him away, no longer in his custom-tailored suit, but in an orange jumpsuit. He was finally out of cards, and the books were finally balanced. The situation with Elena was the hardest part of the audit. She was my daughter, Evelyn's blood, and for a long time, I had tried to tell myself she was just a victim of Marcus's manipulation. But the evidence was undeniable. Her signature was on those checks. She had sat at that long mahogany table Sunday after Sunday, living a life of luxury while knowing it was being paid for by money stolen from her mother's memory. Her lawyer approached me outside the courtroom, eyes wet with practiced desperation. "Mr. Vance, please," he begged. "She was abused. She was controlled. She's a victim here." I looked at him, and for a moment, I saw all the excuses I had made for her over the last 10 years. "Did Marcus hold the pen?" I asked him quietly. "Did he force her hand to write her own name? She is a grown woman, and she made a choice." He asked me to speak to the DA, to write a letter of leniency, to tell the court she was a good person who had simply made a mistake. I said no. I would not interfere. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. I had spent a decade enabling her weakness and her casual cruelty by staying silent. To step in now and save her from the fire she had helped set would be the final, worst act of a failed father. She had to face the ledger on her own. Elena was indicted just as Marcus was, but unlike him, she saw the end of the line. She took the plea. She pleaded guilty to felony misuse of charitable funds. The judge, perhaps seeing her genuine terror, was less harsh than he was with Marcus, but he was no less precise. She was sentenced to 3 years of formal probation and ordered to pay back every single cent, all $230,000, to the Evelyn Vance Foundation. But it was the final condition of her sentence that felt like the most poetic piece of justice I had ever seen a court hand down. The judge assigned her 2,000 hours of mandatory community service, not picking up trash or filing papers in an air-conditioned office. He assigned her to the memory care unit at Harborview Gardens, a locked ward for patients with advanced dementia and Alzheimer's. For the next 2 years, the woman who had tried to have her father declared legally senile so she could steal his money would spend every weekend bathing, feeding, and cleaning up after people who were truly lost. She would spend her days with men and women who didn't know their own names, let alone the faces of their children. I wanted her to see it. I wanted her to smell the reality of the weapon she had tried to use against me. It was a just sentence, perhaps the only real education she had ever received in her life. 6 months passed. The silence that fell over the property was absolute. The grand, ridiculous mansion that Marcus and Elena had built as a monument to their own vanity was gone. I had it sold at auction. I sold the guest house too, every bit of that property. The proceeds were split with the precision of a final audit. Half went to refill and grow the Evelyn Vance Foundation, which was now under the management of a professional board that actually cared about cancer research. The other half went into a locked trust for my grandson, Leo, to be accessed only when he turns 25. I was back in the guest house for one final afternoon, standing among stacked cardboard boxes. The walls were bare, and the air was still. I was in my hidden office, packing the last of my files into a briefcase. The monitors were dark, and the servers were disconnected. The scalpel was going back into retirement, and this time I intended for it to stay there. I heard a hesitant step on the porch outside. Not a knock, just a presence. I walked to the door and opened it. It was Elena. She was transformed, but not in the way a spa or a new designer dress transforms a person. She looked hollowed out. The expensive clothes and jewelry were gone, replaced by a cheap, faded blue volunteer's smock with the Harborview Gardens logo embroidered on the pocket. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her face was pale and thin. She looked 10 years older than the last time I had seen her. The entitlement, the arrogance, and that sharp, airy giggle, all of it had been burned away. Her hands, once perfectly manicured and soft, were red, raw, and smelled faintly of industrial disinfectant. She just stood there in the doorway watching me tape up the last box. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't the one I remembered. It was a rasp, quiet, rough, and entirely dead. "Why?" she asked. I stopped what I was doing, but I didn't turn around. "Why what, Elena? Why did you let it go so far?" she said, her voice trembling with a deep, exhausted kind of rage. You knew. Don't pretend you didn't. You're him. You knew what Marcus was doing. You could have stopped us at any time. She took a step into the empty room, her eyes fixed on my back. When he asked for that money, you could have just said no and shown me the papers then. You could have warned me. A single hot tear ran down her face. But you didn't. You sat there in your little house and watched us destroy ourselves. You didn't have to ruin me. I slowly finished taping the box, smoothing the tape down with my hand. Then I turned to face her. I turned to face the stranger who was my daughter, my hands resting on the cardboard box I had just sealed. I looked at her, really looked at her, not as the child I wanted to protect, but as the woman she had chosen to become. Because if I had stopped you, Elena, I said, my voice quiet and steady, you would have learned absolutely nothing. You would have hated me for a week, called me a paranoid, controlling old man, and then you would have gone right back to him. You would have believed Marcus's next lie, and you would have found another way to get him the money he didn't earn. You would have continued to bleed your mother's foundation dry, one gala at a time, until there was nothing left but the name. I didn't let you do anything, Elena. I simply let you be exactly who you were. I walked over to my old desk, the wood scarred and familiar under my touch. When you were 10 years old, you stole $50 from your mother's purse because she had told you no to a toy you wanted. Evelyn found out immediately. She knew it was you, and she cried for an hour in the bathroom, thinking she had failed as a mother. But then she came out. She hugged you, and she never said a single word about it. She put $50 of her own money back into that purse so I wouldn't notice. She forgave you because her heart was soft and she wanted peace. I looked her in the eyes, my gaze as hard and clear as the glass on my monitors. But I am not Evelyn. I believe in ledgers. The books must always balance, Elena. You never paid for that first theft, so you just kept stealing bigger and bigger things. You didn't respect me, you didn't respect Marcus, and neither of you respected the memory of your mother. You didn't just cross a line, Elena. You erased it. You danced on her grave to pay for a swimming pool. Elena had no answer for the truth. She simply stood there and wept, the silent, shaking sobs of a woman who finally realized that her credit had run out. You didn't destroy yourselves because of a lawsuit, I said, picking up a single white envelope from the desk. You were already destroyed. You were bankrupt in every possible way a human being can be. I just finally presented the bill. I held the envelope out to her. This is the address of a studio apartment in a quiet part of town. The first 3 months of rent are paid. There is a bus pass inside. After that, you are on your own. The books between us are clear. She took the envelope with a shaking hand, searching my face one last time for the father she thought she could always manipulate. But that man was gone. She turned and walked out of the empty guest house, her shadow disappearing into the Florida sun. Hashtag, 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 the auditor's final thought. I am 72 years old. I have retired twice in my life, once from the Department of Justice, and the second time from being an invisible, accommodating, and silent old man. That day in court, I didn't just defend my sanity. I decided to pick up the pen and write the final chapter of a story that had gone off the rails. My name is Arthur Vance, and my books are finally perfectly balanced. This ordeal taught me a painful, necessary lesson. I learned that silence should never be mistaken for weakness. For years, I allowed my love for my daughter to blind me to her contempt. I thought patience was a virtue, but I learned the hard way that patience without firm boundaries is simply permission to be disrespected. True strength isn't about how loud you can shout or how much you can brag at a dinner table. It's about knowing the precise moment to make your move and having the iron discipline to wait for it. I didn't want revenge. I wanted accountability. Sometimes the most profound act of love you can perform, for yourself and even for those who have hurt you, is to finally and decisively balance the books. I picked up my briefcase, took one last look at the empty room, and walked out. Leo was waiting for me in the car. He has a trust fund, a good head on his shoulders, and a grandfather who is no longer invisible. As we drove away from the Thorne estate, I didn't look back. The audit was closed. The air in the courtroom was thick with the smell of old paper and the quiet hum of an overhead fan. I sat there, my spine straight against the hard wooden chair, wearing a suit that had cost more than my son-in-law's first car. To my left, my daughter, Elena, let out a tiny, sharp giggle, the kind of sound you make when you think you've already won. Across from her, Marcus, her husband, just smirked. He didn't even look at me. He looked through me, as if I were a piece of outdated software waiting to be deleted. To them, I was just Arthur Vance, a 72-year-old man who was losing his grip on reality. They thought they were finally putting a senile relic in a cage where he couldn't interfere with their lifestyle anymore. They had no idea that they hadn't just brought an old man to court. They had declared war on a ghost. And this ghost knew exactly where all their bodies were buried. It really began months earlier, on one of those stiflingly humid Miami Sundays. We were gathered for dinner at the Thorne Estate, a sprawling white marble monstrosity that Marcus called minimalist, but I just called cold. The dining table was a massive slab of polished mahogany, so long that you practically needed a megaphone to talk to someone at the other end. I sat at the far edge, watching the condensation drip down my water glass, while Elena and Marcus held court. The glass bottom feature for the new balcony is non-negotiable, Marcus, Elena said, her voice sharp and clinical. She was scrolling through a digital lookbook on her tablet, barely pausing to eat her expensive salad. It needs to look like you're floating over the Atlantic. If we're going to host the charity gala this fall, the wow factor has to be there. Marcus, a man who wore custom-tailored shirts so tight they looked like they were holding back a midlife crisis, didn't even look up from his 2 iPhones. Whatever it takes, babe. As soon as this Riviera deal closes, we're moving into the 9-figure club. We can pave the driveway with gold if it makes the neighbors jealous. They talked over me, through me, and around me. They discussed architects, 5-star catering, and their upcoming trip to the French Riviera as if I were just another piece of furniture. Perhaps an antique armchair that had been inherited and didn't quite fit the modern decor. I am Arthur Vance. I spent 40 years in the highest circles of financial investigation, but in this house, I was invisible. Ever since my wife, Evelyn, passed away 7 years ago, I had tried to be the good father. I sold our family estate in Vermont, a place that breathed with her memory, and bought the guest house on the edge of this massive property. I wanted to be close to my only child. I thought it was what Evelyn would have wanted for our family. My grandson, Leo, who was 17 and mostly communicated in shrugs, was the only one who seemed to notice I was alive. He looked down the long table, his eyes momentarily moving away from his own screen. Hey, Grandpa. Our regional finals are next Friday. You coming to watch? We're playing North Dade. Before I could even smile, Marcus cut him off with a wave of his hand, his voice slick with a practiced, condescending kindness. Don't pester your grandfather, Leo. He's been complaining about his knees again. He needs his rest. At his age, a loud stadium is the last place he should be. Right, Elena. Elena didn't even look up. She just gave that light, airy giggle. He's right, honey. Let Dad be. He's probably exhausted just from the walk over here from the guest house. We'll send him some photos of the game. They didn't ask. They decided. They diagnosed my energy, my interests, and my physical state without a single glance in my direction. I sat there in silence, looking down at the cold piece of sea base on my plate. I had mistaken my silence for patience for a long time. I realized now that to them it was just permission to erase me. The real shift happened 3 days later. It was a Tuesday evening, and the Florida sun was finally dipping below the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. I heard a sharp, aggressive knock on the door of my guest house. It was Marcus. This was a rare occurrence. Marcus usually avoided my small home as if it were a leper colony, likely because it lacked the high-tech gadgets and gold-plated fixtures he used to validate his existence. He was carrying a bottle of vintage scotch, a bottle that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. He thrust it into my hands with a salesman's wide, toothy grin. For you, Artie. The good stuff, straight from the Highlands. He knew I didn't drink. My cardiologist had been very specific about that after my minor heart procedure last year. This wasn't a gift. It was a prop. Marcus was always a performer. He sold luxury lifestyles to people who couldn't afford them, and he lived his life as if he were always being filmed for a reality show. He assessed every room he entered for its market value, and right now he was assessing me. He didn't waste time on the scotch. After about 30 seconds of complaining about the humidity, he leaned in, his expensive cologne filling my small living room. "Artie, listen. I'm sitting on the play of a lifetime. A luxury boutique hotel project in the Keys. It's a lock, but we hit a tiny snag with the environmental permits. Just a temporary liquidity issue." He leaned closer, his eyes bright with a desperate kind of greed. "I know you own this guest house outright. It's a prime piece of real estate, even if it's small. I just need you to put a little leverage against it. 500,000. That's it. Just a bridge loan to show the bank we've got the capital." He saw my silence and tried to close the deal. 6 months, tops. I'll pay you back 750,000. That's a massive return, Artie. You won't find that in any savings account. It's for the family. For Elena's future. I watched him. He wasn't just enthusiastic, he was sweating. A fine sheen of moisture was gathering at his hairline. "Marcus," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "I'm 72. My risk-taking days ended decades ago. My money is for my care and for Leo's education. The answer is no." The transformation was instantaneous. It was as if a light switch had been flipped. The salesman's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian sneer. "Unbelievable," he hissed, standing up so quickly he nearly knocked over my lamp. "Just unbelievable. After everything we do for you? You live here on our land, rent-free, eating our food, and you won't lift a finger to help your own flesh and blood." "I paid for this house with my own money, Marcus," I said quietly. "You're a selfish old man, Arthur," he spat. "You're sitting on a pile of gold while your family is out here grinding. You'll regret this. You think you're so smart, but you're just a ghost in a suit."